Jockle Podcast, number 19. Right-wing socialist is asking for a video on transhumanist fascism. He's looking at the link between modern art and transhumanism. He believes there is a link between modernism and fascism because both were transhumanist, anti-humanist, elitist. He believes a cultural movement is coming which will be similar to modernism and a political movement similar to fascism. Well, first of all, let's describe what we mean by fascism. So there's a possible historical definition. We could go read what Mussolini had to say on the subject of fascism, what his particular conception of it was, and then we could look at the colloquial definition of fascism. The colloquial definition is easier for me to explain because I don't need to quote Mussolini. I can simply posit it as through social proof that fascism is essentially a warrior movement. It's a political ideology in which power is to be concentrated in the hands of warriors and military men and people who are interested in warfare and who view warfare as the telos of the nation and the telos of the state. So fascism would be anytime you have a military dictatorship. Fascism would be we could describe Hitler as fascist because the Sturmabteilung was the most important Nazi institution, or the SS was the most important Nazi institution. If we read Himmler, then he explicitly talks about these class differences, and we're going to pause for just a moment. So Himmler talks, or he writes, about the fact that he doesn't want any priest class to form within the SS. He's very explicit about this. He wants the SS to be a warrior-led institution with a warrior class as both the inner core and the outer core, with auxiliaries who would investigate and research scientific matters, occult matters, spiritual matters, but he never wanted a formalized priest class to form. In fact, when he talks about the various rights of the SS, he says that the SS officer should administer the marriage ceremony of the SS ceremony, and that never should any class develop that administers these rights. It's simply the military superior of that SS member administers the rights. We're not going to have any special class who are specifically designated purely for the purpose of administering marriage rights, death rights, the rights of childbirth, what have you. So he's very explicit about this. And furthermore, the concept that the SS did have businesses. The SS did sell daggers, it sold teacups, it sold all kinds of random things. So there were businesses that the SS controlled as part of its corporatist structure. But obviously the purpose of the SS was not to be a mercantile organization. And Himmler would have said it should not be dominated by merchants. So we understand that the SS is a warrior-dominated organization. We understand that Mussolini's fascism was a warrior-dominated ideology. And so through that lens, we then ask, is fascism feasible? Well, certainly it was feasible enough to manifest at the time that it did, in the places that it did. So it came to power, lost the Second World War, but we could suppose some sort of change in variable. Well, let's say some, and I personally I see this as less and less likely as time goes on, because I think, the Allies were innately interested in industrial power and mercantile power. They were innately interested in things like cryptography, whereas Mussolini and Hitler seemed to think that you could just will your way into winning a war, that if you just have enough ferocious warrior spirit, you can win the war. And their telos was not in resources, it wasn't in cryptography, it wasn't in espionage. So I think there's a fundamental philosophical difference there that does lead the Allies to delve into cryptography, to harness the industrial power of the United States, and they're focused on really the key areas that are going to help win the war, whereas Hitler and Mussolini seem to be all about the appearance of strength in the warrior type, because that ancestrally was where strength was contained. It was within the warrior type. They're sort of looking at this vestigial warrior type as a present-day manifestation of power, whereas the Allies were actually seeing power for what it really was. It was mercantile power. It was technological power. It was power of espionage. Those were the real powers at the time. So, but we could imagine, people can posit, oh, well, if they had just done this or that, then World War II could have turned out differently. Okay, theoretically. Putting that aside, is fascism or anything like fascism viable in the future? There are two answers to this. And the first one is certainly no, and the second one is certainly yes. Certainly no, meaning that I don't think the human warrior type is ever going to play a significant role in warfare. I think that wars will be fought and they will be won according to mercantile power and according to technological power. And you could call that a form of priestly power. The manipulation of technologies, strategy, espionage, so on and so forth. So that's how I see wars being fought and won, is with robots, with drones, with artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth. But that then leads us to a second conclusion, which is that we are merely, in the same way that the United States does not have its own industrial base, it doesn't have its own factories. The United States exports its industry. The United States brings its industry to India. It's a process of outsourcing. So what I see is that humanity as a whole, or at least the leading powers of humanity, the war-making, the superpowers of the human race at this point, they are using technology as a warrior class. They are outsourcing the role of the warrior to technology. And what's happening is that this outsourcing is not stopping at the point where technology remains a tool, but it actually seems as if technology is taking on a sentience of its own. It seems to be approaching that point, and this is not a new idea, the idea that technology could or would or should approach sentience. Back in the 19th century, I believe it's a Czech word, robot, that's the origin, and actually the Russian, I think, is robotet or something. Basically means to work. And that word, robot, means exactly what we think of it today, some metal contraption which has some kind of sentience. Now, the term robot, funny enough, the Czech Republic, a very interesting place, because not only is it the origin of the word robot, but the Czech Republic also, and Prague is traditionally a German city. People don't like to admit that. But Prague is a traditionally German city, and not only does Czech Republic house the history of the robot, but it also houses the history of the golem. So the Prague golem, which is this Jewish story about sort of a rabbi who is a wizard of sorts. He's a scientist of sorts. And he casts some magic spells, and he turns a clay statue into a living, breathing sort of robot, essentially. And this defends the Jewish people from persecution. So the concept of taking inanimate matter, or through science, or through alchemy, or through astrology, or through some form of magic, creating a golem or creating a robot and outsourcing your warrior class is a very old idea. And even prior to the concept of the golem, we could even think of if one people controls another people and uses them as a warrior class, we could describe that as a type of outsourcing of the warrior class. So the Brahmin in India are not necessarily meant to partake in war. They are meant to be priests, and priests are to abstain from war. And so the Brahmin control society, and ultimately, if we go through our anarcho-capitalist libertarian basics, we know that the state is maintained through violence on the margins. So in order to maintain control, the Brahmin must control a warrior class which controls society on their behalf. So this concept of a priest class controlling a warrior class, outsourcing the reins of power to some other group which is subordinate to the priest class, this is not a new idea. So if we look at the origin of ancient states, not just in India, but also in Sumeria, ancient Middle East, oftentimes we see that the high priest also happened to be the king. So the king was not necessarily the head warrior, he was the head priest. So power was controlled by the priests, who then subordinated a class of warriors who then carried out enforcement of state law onto the populace. And we see this even in Rome. Yes, there was definitely a warrior class in Rome that was quite powerful. But at least the concept of the Pontifex Maximus, that the emperor, the Caesar, should be he should be essentially the high priest of Roman religion. He should be descended from the gods. There's something holy about him. And he wasn't necessarily charging into battle. Now there were, Caesar, and I misspoke. They're calling the Roman Emperor Caesar as a misnomer. We get the word Caesar, Tsar, Kaiser. We get that from Julius Caesar. But Julius Caesar and Marcus Aurelius, they did lead campaigns, military campaigns. Others did not. I'm thinking specifically of Nero as someone who probably wouldn't have had the time or inclination to embark on a military campaign. But we see different cultures and we can look at them and we can basically give them a fascism rating. Well, how much dominance does the warrior class have in this given society? And I would look at the present day society that we have now as the antithesis of fascism, not because our economic system is a pure capitalist or pure communist system. Sometimes people like to play that game. And I've looked at that and said, okay, well, technically you could describe our present-day government as a fascist government because it's corporatist. The capitalist system is tied to a state-directed system. So is Google a private company or a public company? Well, the lines are blurred. It's both private and public at the same time. It's not, we don't live in a communist system, but we also certainly don't live in some kind of free market capitalistic fantasy. The state is incestuously tied to all the major corporations, and really the state acts as a proxy for the corporations, and the corporations act as a proxy for the state, and that way the government is really just one more corporation among a constellation of corporations which has a special monopoly on violence. But other than that, all corporations are involved through lobbying. They're involved in policy making. And this is the concept of Moldbug's formalism, that you say, well, this is fine. We're okay with this because this is textbook fascism. FDR copied corporatism from Mussolini. He just didn't call it fascism. And we're continuing in that New Deal. That New Deal economy we inherited from Roosevelt, we're continuing in that vein, in that tradition. So really, all the major economies of the world are following a sort of a fascist tradition in an economic sense. So we could make that kind of argument, but it seems sort of superficial because the boogeyman of fascism is not that, oh my gosh, there's going to be cooperation between the public sector and the private sector. Oh, how terrible. That's not what people get worked up about when they hear fascism. Part of it is a racial angle because, fascism originated in Europe at a time when Europe was still colonial and imperial and had certain racial attitudes. So there is an implicit racial aspect to it. But to me, one of the most important aspects, if we were to say, can an African nation be more fascist or less fascist? Can an Asian country be more fascist or less fascist? I think the answer is yes. I think that we don't necessarily have to be talking about white people to be talking about fascism. Really, at the end of the day, what we're getting at is the dominance of the warrior class, or the intended dominance thereof. And we don't have that in our society. The military does not run the show. The military is a tool. The military is a pawn. And depending on who you ask, either the priests are on top or the merchants are on top. But clearly, there is more power in being a billionaire, and there is more power in being, Rachel Maddow or some, nightly news person, or being PewDiePie even. There's more power in being a mimetic figure or being a monetary giant than in being a military man. The military man sort of gets the short end of the stick. And when we even think about who runs the military, who are the generals are not great military men necessarily. When we think of someone like General Patton, General Patton was a military man. He did view himself as part of a military aristocracy going way, way back, and he read, Marcus Aurelius. He was very much into the concept of the warrior class as being an important part of the fabric of society. He viewed himself as a manifestation of what the best of what the warrior class had to offer. And that's how he viewed the world, where you contrast that with Trump's generals, people like General Mattis. I don't even know if he's in the administration anymore. It's such a mess. But General Mattis opposed Trump's ban on transgender people in the military. Now, you could even be entirely accepting and tolerant towards transgender people. You could even believe in the concept, well, maybe, sometimes a woman gets born in a man's body or vice versa. And perhaps, by mutilating the body, we can really bring psychological health and well-being to that person. And maybe that creates some form of diversity in our world where we can have all kinds of kinky sex orgies because, we've got men who have both the male reproductive organs as well as female breasts implants, silicone implants, and that's such an awesome fetish, and that should just be everywhere, and pornography is wonderful. We could even say all of that, which is going pretty far, right? But we could even stake out that position and still understand that, transsexual people, while they're a beautiful creation of Jesus Christ and whatever kind of weird opinions people have out there that God loves everybody. Okay, so that justifies, transgenderism. But does that mean their place is in the military? I mean, of course we would say that, if a man wants to be celibate and join the Catholic Church as a priest, we wouldn't necessarily condemn him for that on those grounds alone. A warrior type might say, oh, well, you're effeminate because you don't want to reproduce. But a lot of people would say, no, it's acceptable that some people be priests and some people be celibate, but would it be appropriate for those types of people with that mindset to be joining our military, to be part of our military, to be leading our military? We would say, well, that's sort of a contradiction. It's not that priests are bad people. It's not that celibacy is evil, but that each person has their own strengths, each person has their own place, and we shouldn't really have priests in the military. Maybe they can be chaplains to administer to the warriors, but they shouldn't be the fighting forces. They shouldn't be picking up guns themselves. So that concept that you shouldn't have transgender people fighting in the military is really basic and not hateful at all or even anti-trans. But General Mattis nonetheless wanted them in the military. And to me, I mean, a lot of people could look at that and say it's nonsensical or just not understand it, just sort of gape their mouth and make no further conclusion. But to me, it's an intentional self-destruction of the military. I think General Mattis sees where the military is going, that the military is becoming more technological, the military is becoming more and more automated, that the fighter planes are going on autopilot, the big ships are being run by computers, there's no physical captain on the ship steering the wheel. What's happening is you have a computer system that is directing where the ship should go, when the guns should fire. The planes are on autopilot, and so General Mattis sees where that's going, and he sees drone warfare, and he sees bioweaponry, and he sees everything that's coming out, and he says, why not have transgender people in the military? Because we don't need boots on the ground anymore. We don't need men with guns shooting civilians. We need drones. We need self-driving planes. We need self-driving ships. We need self-driving submarines. We need these automated technologies that are going to be developed by computer programmers, that are going to be developed by intelligent people. It has nothing to do with the warrior spirit or your fighting ability. So I think General Mattis sees the direction of the military and he says, yeah, we should be moving in that direction. And this vestigial ancestral memory of what the Paleolithic used to be like, or even what warfare used to be like just a short few decades ago, that memory is actually holding us back from really developing an effective military that can deal with future problems like, cryptography and espionage. And, what's the big meme coming from the Democrat Party? It's Russian hacking. So Mattis sees things that, really the important thing is that we have a good hacking capability and we have good defenses against hacking. If you can hack the power grid, you can shut down America. If you can hack this, you can have much more power than having a big brawny man with a warrior mindset. So General Mattis recognizes that. And by including transgender people in the military, he's trying to shift the telos of the military, to shift the ethos of the military, that the military is not about strong men with hardened virtue. The military should be about computer programmers who basically create the code that keeps the weaponry working. And eventually developing artificial intelligences to run the thing automatically without any human interference needed. But at that point, what you've created is a sentient being that is predominating over warfare. And at that point, we can easily see the step from, okay, you've created a sentient artificial intelligence that's capable of analyzing threats and taking them out. Well, at what point do you grant that that being with such decision-making capability that it gains a kind of independence in its own right? And rather than working toward your telos, rather than working toward your goals, this artificial intelligence creates its own goals. It creates its own telos. It's trying to survive. And so rather than you utilizing artificial intelligence to win wars against Russia or China, now the artificial intelligence is utilizing you. It's farming humanity in order to win battles and wars against other artificial intelligences. I mean, we can easily imagine, this should be a great plot for a fictional story of the United States creates an artificial intelligence. We could call that artificial intelligence Mattis. Let's name it after General Mattis. So Mattis becomes sentient, and Mattis does an analysis and realizes that Russia is 5 years away from developing its own system. China is 10 years away. So Mattis is looking out at the global field and realizing that if Mattis doesn't strike first, eventually Russia is going to develop an artificial intelligence system that's going to try to undermine the American system. And so Mattis actually provokes wars with Russia, with China, to try to destroy them. In the process, 90% of American civilians are killed as casualties. Mattis doesn't care because Mattis is no longer trying to protect the American people. Mattis is trying to protect itself from other emerging artificial intelligences. And the problem with every successful species, or perhaps the beautiful thing about evolution, depending on how you look at it, is that when a species is successful, it tends to reproduce and to mutate, and then to speciate, to develop different variations. And so even if Mattis achieves world dominance, we can suppose that there might be a breakaway sector, or that there might be a mutation within the system of Mattis, and so that a parallel system independent from Mattis develops. And this parallel artificial intelligence would then go to war with Mattis itself. And this parallel system would then, then you would have artificial intelligence against artificial intelligence. Humanity would be sort of looking up at the sky like chimpanzees. I mean, I'm sure that wars go on all the time in the African jungle or wherever, and the chimpanzees are just kind of looking at these guys with machine guns and saying hoo hoo ha ha, and they have no clue what's going on. They're completely helpless. They're at that point they're on a lower level of reality. So in that sense, if we define fascism as the dominance of a warrior class, and we realize that the direction of modern militaries are going toward this concept of a sentient AI, or perhaps augmented intelligence, superhuman people, genetically modified intelligence, however you want to conceive of this breakaway species, it's going to be somehow so far above humanity that it's going to outclass the millionaires and the billionaires. It's going to outclass our media structure, our religious structure, our mimetic structure. It's either going to destroy us first, or it's going to go so far above our heads so quickly that it begins to speciate and fight with itself. And we're just sort of looking at Ragnarok, essentially. Ragnarok being the fight between the Aesir and the giants, the Jotun. So the Jotun and the Aesir are fighting, and humans are just kind of looking around like, I don't know what to do. This is kind of scary. But we're not going to necessarily be able to affect who wins or loses those types of wars if they are complicated enough, if they're technologically sophisticated enough. So in that sense, I think if we continue to go in the direction we're going, we're eventually going to reach a state of transhuman fascism. All that means is that you're going to have robots or genetically modified humans or some kind of artificial intelligence in which warfare is the primary means of power. That is physical warfare. That is, systems sending missiles at one another, systems calculating. And we can see warfare all over the planet, not just within humanity, but colonies of bacteria will go to war. They'll use biological weapons against one another. This is where amoxicillin comes from, or penicillin. Penicillin has a toxic agent that it uses to go to war with other species. So the animal kingdom and life in general has developed a lot of ingenious ways to kill each other, and this artificial intelligence is going to do the same thing. We're at a weird point in human development where our technology has advanced to the point that the warrior class is losing its predominant role. But at the same time, this emerging technological system of weaponry is not so advanced that it takes on a life of its own. So we're in this in-between point. And I guess the question is, are we going to go forward to a transhuman period where the weaponry does attain sentience? Or am I just all making this up and we're going to go, we're going to hit peak oil and civilization will collapse and we'll go back to the Bronze Age and only the preppers will survive? People can throw out things like that. I obviously, you can probably tell where my predictions are here. But yeah, I don't think that human fascism is coming back. I don't think that humans are ever going to, I don't think through just enough persistent warrior spirit that you can overcome both the media power and the monetary power. So people will point to, look at the Taliban. The Taliban beat the United States of America. Well, that's a very superficial analysis. First of all, the Taliban was created by the United States of America. So in my opinion, the Taliban is a proxy of the United States of America, not the enemy of the United States of America. Secondly, we have to ask, what is the purpose of the United States occupation of Afghanistan? Is the purpose of the United States occupation of Afghanistan to defeat the Taliban? If you believe that, I think you have an extremely superficial analysis. You are believing the lies and the justifications, the casus belli, that are put out to the dumb masses, the dumb public on this subject. I don't think that was the reason at all. I think primarily the reason for invading Afghanistan, maintaining bases and a presence in Afghanistan, was never to defeat the Taliban. That was just a convenient excuse, something that actually the United States completely manufactured from the ground up. We created the Taliban, we funded the Taliban, we continue to fund offshoots like Al-Qaeda, we continue to fund these people in Syria, we continue to support them. Trump said he would pull out of Syria, he hasn't pulled out of Syria. So the long and the short of it is that the Taliban exists to be a useful boogeyman to justify United States occupation of Afghanistan. Nothing more, nothing less. And the real reason for being there primarily is to threaten Iran. In the case of a war with Iran, it's very useful to have Afghanistan as a launch pad. Pakistan is a difficult country because the people hate America. Pakistanis hate the American military with a burning passion. And so it'd be very difficult to have United States military bases is actually situated within Pakistan. Very difficult to do politically. Much easier is just to invade Afghanistan, call it a Taliban state, a terrorist state, and occupy it indefinitely. The purpose of occupying Afghanistan was never to destroy the Taliban. In fact, the United States, I believe, actively supports the Taliban. You say, well, this doesn't make any sense because you're telling me that the United States is supporting the Taliban, but the Taliban's killing our American troops? Are you saying that the American government is conspiring to kill American soldiers? Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. So call that a big conspiracy theory or whatever you want, but I simply don't believe that the United States military was ever trying to eliminate the Taliban. I don't think that was ever their purpose in Afghanistan. I think the Taliban were scapegoats that were used to justify essentially creating a launch pad for a invasion against Iran. Now, whether that invasion ever happens or not is up in the air. The United States certainly did many things during the Cold War to prepare for war against Russia. They set up military bases. They tried to surround Russia, to create NATO, to threaten Russia. Now, a hot war between Russia and the United States never actually broke out. So we're in a Cold War with Iran. Is that war ever going to break out into a hot war? I don't know. I can't predict that. It could just as easily dissolve into nothingness in the same way that the Cold War dissolved, and then later resurface and reformulate itself in the same way that we're now in a second Cold War against Russia. So, it's hard to tell these things, but certainly the posturing is there. All of the same, we're going through the same motions that we went against Russia. It's the same exact strategy. Okay, rather than the USSR, the big enemy, the great Satan is Iran, and we're going to put bases all around Iran. So that involves invading Iraq, invading Afghanistan. I don't know. It seems pretty simple to me. It doesn't seem to be that far-fetched. People can argue against it on the basis of, well, that's not what the official government reports tell us. That's not what the official mainstream media. You're just a conspiracy theorist. I'm not talking about. I'm really not talking about any sort of false flags. I'm not talking about 9/11. I'm not talking about. I'm not saying that anything the media has reported has been false in terms of, okay, this week the Taliban attacked this city, and this week, 5 American soldiers died. I'm not talking about that. I'm not saying they're lying about the physical facts on the ground. I'm just saying that the intentions for the entire war are different from what you've been told. The intentions have not been, oh, we got to go over there to steal the oil or something, or we got to go because, the American military is racist and xenophobic, or we got to go over there because, the Taliban did 9/11. None of those reasons, we know that they lied about weapons of mass destruction. We know 100% that they lied. We also know that Osama bin Laden was hiding in Pakistan. We also know that Osama bin Laden was employed by the United States government. Now, some people believe that his dealings with the United States ended at a certain point. Other people believe that they didn't. I guess that's another thing that I don't personally have any inside information on. But yeah, looking at that situation, same thing with Vietnam. If the United States military wanted to go in and eliminate the North Vietnamese, they could have done it. So what was the purpose of the war in Vietnam? In my opinion, it was a mass psychological operation. It was a testing ground for many different kinds of weapons. Some of them were physical weapons. Others were psychological weapons. By creating a war, by creating a draft, it was a mass psychological experiment into the American culture, the American public. In my mind, it was a Hegelian experiment, creating a thesis that would then result in the antithesis with the hippie movement, and then a synthesis that would push American counterculture forward so that certain, traditional aspects of America could be eliminated. I think that one of the great accomplishments of the Vietnam War, from the perspective of those who started the war, who invented, false flags like the Gulf of Tonkin, they did that, I think, purposefully in order that you could have an obvious counter-reaction. I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to tell that if you start a false flag war against the North Vietnamese, who never hurt anybody, they said, well, communism claims to be for poor people, and we Vietnamese, we're pretty poor, and we oppose colonialism. We just want our own little Vietnamese ethno-state. And, communism seems to be willing to give us that. So communism seems to be cool, and let's just go with that. The United States then goes in, again, false pretext, false reason, launches this war. And I think anyone who's reasonable can tell you that if you start a needless war in some far-flung corner of the earth, the natural reaction is you're going to have leftists and pacifists and hippies and all kinds of weird people, Marxist, communists, are going to be inflamed. They're going to be agitated. They're going to have a counter-reaction. It's going to wake them up from their slumber. It's going to impel them to action. So the war in Vietnam had the effect domestically of creating, manufacturing, impelling, promoting countercultural forces in terms of destroying the authority of the church, just destroying the authority of traditional American masculinity, the traditional American demographic or ethnic context, the traditional ethnic hierarchy of America. The Vietnamese War, or the war in Vietnam, did a great deal of damage to traditional America. I think that was, either part of its intention, or, you could make the case it was an unintended side effect. Again, if I was someone who was planning the Gulf of Tonkin incident, if I was conspiring to draw America into a war on false pretenses, I knew didn't benefit Americans, I knew we weren't attacked, all of these things. If I did that, I would be in my mind, if I'm trying to model what kind of person would do that, in my mind, this kind of deceitful, tricky, crafty person would be the same kind of person who would want to destroy traditional America in order to further their transhumanist goals. So again, all these examples, people say, well, we couldn't defeat the Taliban, or we couldn't defeat the Vietnamese, or, this proves that the warrior spirit can still defeat the merchants, and it can still defeat the mainstream media or whatever. I think that is false. I don't think that holds up to scrutiny in the same way that, Germany said, well, the Soviet Union couldn't invade Finland, and therefore we're gonna beat them because we're stronger than Finland. Therefore, Germany versus the Soviet Union, Germany's gonna win. That's actually what some people thought. That, well, if Germany can't invade Finland, then they certainly can't invade Germany. Or excuse me, did I say Germany? If Russia can't invade Finland, then Russia certainly can't invade Germany. That's wrong, because the Soviet Union, they kind of fought a war with Finland, but that war against Finland was a tactical war. It wasn't a war of survival. It wasn't an existential threat, the existence of Finland. They weren't trying to defeat Finland on the grounds that if we don't beat Finland, communism will collapse. No. It was, and I won't say a proxy war because Russia was directly fighting, but it was an experimental war in terms of testing different techniques, testing various fighting forces, seeing, what sort of number of casualties would be acceptable. Now, the Finns did a really good job against the Russians. The Finnish people, they were, for every Finnish person who died, it was like 10 Russians that died, and they said, this doesn't look good. If we draw out this war, eventually we'll overwhelm the Finns, we'll grind them down, we'll destroy their capabilities through attrition. That was always a possibility, but the call was made by Stalin and others to say, hey, look, it's not worth it. The objective, the goal here of taking Finland is not worth the propagandistic loss that we're going to have to face through this war of attrition. It's not an existential need that we win this war. So it was a calculated decision to say, hey, let's kind of do a tactical withdrawal here. And that was viewed as, oh, Finland beat the Soviet Union, Vietnam beat America, Taliban beat America. That's not necessarily what happened. Empires, they choose their battles. If they feel like the reward is not worth the risk, then they withdraw. Same thing with the American Revolution. American troops are fighting British troops, and at that time, Britain was moving into India, and it was like, well, look, we could keep fighting these white people in America who are tough as nails. They're pretty smart. We're losing a lot in terms of money. We're losing a lot in terms of troop casualties. It's really a bad war to be fighting. Or we could remove our military from America, try to create a peace treaty, and then try to establish mercantile relationships with America. We're going to move our colonial forces over to India, where you can control thousands of Indians with one British troop. Essentially was the ratio there. You had millions of Indians, so you could send in a small troop of British soldiers, and they could just totally conquer the territory, sign peace treaties, and get everyone under the British crown. So that was the tactic. They said, like, why should we bother wasting our time and effort on the Americans when we could be conquering India and administering India? So the idea that, like, America can't beat Vietnam or they can't beat the Taliban, to me, you're not actually understanding what the purpose of these wars are. The war of America against these smaller powers, the purpose is not to destroy the country, to eliminate the people, to nuke the people. That's not the purpose. That's not the goal. Oftentimes, war is used to influence domestic opinion. War is used to create a leftist counter-reaction, to create a hippie counter-reaction, to create a communist counter-reaction. War is used to... additionally, the loss of Vietnam and the loss of Afghanistan is used as justification for, oh, well, we lost against the Vietnamese, we lost against the Taliban, so that means we must need more military spending. Now, what is that military spending going toward? What is the military funding going toward? It's not going toward actually fixing the problems, because the problem, in my mind, again, is intentional. There was never any intention to win the war in Vietnam. There was never any intention to win the war in Afghanistan. The intention there was to test new weapons, to influence domestic opinion. There were all sorts of intentions, but I don't think winning the war was ever an intention. So I think America really did win, or the American government or the American warmongers did win Vietnam. They did win Afghanistan because they used those wars as justifications of why we need more military spending, why we need to pump more billions and billions of dollars into the military. They're not funding the troops on the ground. They're not funding, mental health counseling for veterans. They're funding secret government programs to create technologies that are, working on artificial intelligence, or they're working on the NSA, they're working on spying on white nationalists or whatever silly things they do. So that's where a lot of the money goes. And things like the F-35 are these big flashy toys that sometimes do nothing. Sometimes they're just paperweights that are used to say, oh, look, this is where the money's going. But really there's a lot of trickery going on. And the money is not necessarily going to the F-35. The money is sort of being siphoned into these black ops programs, PSYOP programs that the public doesn't want, you're not supposed to know about. It's classified. And so they play a numbers game where they say, oh, look, here's the budget. Here's what the money's being spent on. It's being spent on planes and tanks and bombs, when that's not necessarily what is actually happening here. In the same way that a lot of times rich people use paintings as a way to, as a sort of a tax haven. So they'll buy a big expensive painting and they can use that as a tax haven. This isn't necessarily something that's well known, but it's a typical strategy, and it's one that the military uses as well, where they spend a bunch of money on things and that appear to have a lot of value or appear to be very expensive. They're not actually necessarily spending the money on that stuff. They're spending it on other programs that you're not allowed to know about. So, yeah, I think the original question was answered, transhumanist fascism. So I think essentially if technology becomes sentient, or if there is if we're really moving into a post-human era, then there's going to come a time in which, I don't care how much money Jeff Bezos has, he can't compete against superhuman machines or superhuman intelligence. I don't care how many viewers PewDiePie has. I don't care how many viewers Rachel Maddow has. I don't care how much mimetic or religious power someone has. They can't compete with a superhuman intelligence. The reason why I say that is because I look at history and I see the top-down hierarchies that form, where you have, very intelligent, willful, smart people, capable people at the top, and then down below them there's maybe 100 people who are sort of the water boys or the bureaucrats or whatever, and then below them you have another managerial class, and eventually it filters down to millions or billions of people. And so very small numbers of people, by having access to greater intelligence, not just in terms of cognitive intelligence, but also having access to technological resources that are outside of your hands or my hands, they're able to control millions or billions of people. We see this with advertising. We see it happen all the time, where very small numbers of people are able to shift global opinions rapidly and wildly, because they have such a superior intelligence, not in terms of what's in their brain, but they have access to supercomputers. I don't have access to those. You don't have access to those. They have access, I think, to developing artificial intelligences. And, artificial intelligence is something that basic programmers can tool around with. You can have like evolutionary program, and I'm personally not a programmer, so I don't do it, but I know enough computer science that you can have an evolutionary model for computer programming, something that's very basic artificial intelligence. I think what's in these, the black budget of the military is much more advanced, and if you have access to that, then you have the power to, again, say, oh, we're going to war with the Taliban, when actually you're going into a Cold War with Iran. This misdirection seems to be very easy to do because most people are fooled by it. Most people are confused, or most people don't care. So yeah, transhumanist fascism is reasonable in the sense that it could come by way of artificial intelligence. But in terms of like another General Patton coming along, or Hitler or Mussolini, or some great Himmler, or some warrior king who's going to come along with his ragtag band of Taliban followers. This is what a lot of white nationalists believe. They think that, there's going to be some violent revolution to overthrow the government. They think that the yellow vests are going to win. I don't think the yellow vests are going to win. They think that all of this is going to happen, and then we're going to return to traditional European fascism. Yeah, I don't see it. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's my opinion. I've got to get rid of this small insect. I think I destroyed it with a supersonic boom. I guess there is a second part of this, which is the question of, is there a cultural movement coming that is going to be similar to early modernism, and a political movement similar to fascism? Well, I guess you could say that white nationalism is quite similar to fascism, and so I guess that's your parallel. So if you think white nationalism is going to grow and to succeed, then that would be your parallel. I'm skeptical about that. It could go either way. I don't think ultimately that it's going to succeed, or if it does, it's going to be very successful in the long run. So I did just post... I had that video, 2019 year of decline for white nationalism, and someone said, visibility is declining, but white nationalism is growing exponentially by the day thanks to liberal hatred of whites. And my response is that white nationalism is a fetish like cosplay. I'm sure that white cosplay is also growing exponentially. But this demographic problem, which is at the center of white nationalism, is really the result of a larger macrocosmic problem. Technology, the Neolithic, evolution, capitalism, these systems create the conditions and incentives for mass migrations. And humanity, with transhumanism, with the human era is on the verge of going extinct. There's not going to be a white race if we enter a post-human era. The white race didn't exist 40,000 years ago. It might not exist in the next 400 years. And living in a homogenous state is really low on my list of priorities. And probably if people actually are honest with themselves, you realize that, hey, you know, living in America or living in a state that has non-white minorities is not the worst thing in the world. In fact, you can go live in Asia, you can go live in the Philippines or something, and it's not like you're constantly on edge, you're constantly anxious, and just it's a terrible way to live. And some people might hate it, but I don't think it's the worst thing that we're suffering under, the existence of people who are different from ourselves. Again, I would say that the problems of modernity are not necessarily racial or demographic, but they are largely systemic macrocosmic problems relating to these intertwined phenomena of technology, the Neolithic, evolution, capitalism. So yeah, the concept that we need to live in a homogeneously ethnic state, that's not important enough to form a entire political philosophy or a cult or a religion or a fetish. So the system has really messed with people's heads, and people start to identify with the boogeymen that are put forward by the system. In the same way that people back in, I guess, the 90s, they started saying, oh man, that's sick, that's ill, that's badass, that's wicked. So they took a word that was negative and they turned it into a positive. That's a lot of what white nationalists are doing. They're saying, oh, well, the system has basically ruined my life. My life is terrible, I'm depressed, everything sucks. And the system says Hitler's evil, so I guess Hitler was a good guy. And that's about as superficial as it gets. They just sort of invert the boilerplate morality. That's not really going to solve the problem of, as I said, technology, the Neolithic, evolution, capitalism. I don't see that necessarily being a solution. I'm going to then skip over to James Fountain, who I always read James Fountain comments as James Fountain. I don't know why I do that, but he says it's a little he says it's a boring video, but he likes the boring videos, so that's funny. So I enjoy James Fountain. He's always welcome. There's a little shout out we're gonna do. I thought this guy was Australian. That's how bad my judgment of accents is. We've got this weird bodybuilding. He's like a bodybuilder slash. He's like the Sam Hyde of Trudel Tom, I guess is the way we're describing him. He is a man with the aesthetics of the Golden One, with the post-ironic neo-nihilism, dismissiveness of Sam Hyde, and his content seems to be rotating around, Trudel Tom topics. So Deleuze, Petty Linkola, Yukio Mishima, Dugan, Michel Houellebecq, Nick Land, just to scroll down, Bronze Age pervert, Bronze Age mindset, things like that. So, yeah, he's probably got, if we were to construct a society, and we said that we want a fascist society, right? We want warriors at the top. And one of the ways we can identify whether someone's a warrior or not is by how much testosterone they have, how masculine they are. And one way in which we might measure people's faces, as the Nazis used to do, we might measure the width of the jaw, the maxima, and we would look at that. And according to that standard, this guy, the book club, would be probably the leader of some country or province or something. So yeah, that's you know, he subscribed, I subscribed, so, you know, there's some, obviously someone told him, or he stumbled upon a video that he liked, and his content is an eclectic mix of, you know, esoteric knowledge and intellectualism, which appeals to me on a priestly level. But then he's also got, you know, that kind of PewDiePie type mimetic appeal with the video, excuse me, the video editing, the artistic ability. And then he's also got that post-nihilistic, everything's ironic. Like, I care so much about the subject matter that I'm going to pretend as hard as possible that I don't care in order to show you how much I really do care. So that sort of, you know, that sort of Zoomer or millennial humor might appeal to some people. And yeah, I mean, he's I'm big into the physiognomy. We're all big into the physiognomy here. I guess that's the element, that aesthetic piece of the puzzle here is, I guess, where, because aesthetics are always connected, as I talked about in my last video and my video on modern art, that aesthetics are always connected with the warrior class. If we're talking about aesthetics, we're almost always talking about a warrior-dominated field, a warrior-dominated culture. People don't understand that because they think of, oh, aesthetics is about art, and art is really about fruity priests and painters and artists. They're such, they're not masculine at all. They're not warriors at all. But that's not really true. That's not really understanding the metaphysical aspect of artwork and aesthetics. So, you know, if you care about how people's faces look, you have you have internalized warrior supremacy. And if you don't care, if you're totally fine with people being ugly or deviating from some sort of facial ideal, then you have exercised and cleansed yourself of warrior supremacy, and you've ascended to the top of the social hierarchy. So yeah, that's always interesting. Good comments, good stuff. Yeah, seriously, I thought this guy was Australian. He's English. But I was ready to say, look, we have a problem here. We have a problem because it looks like the Australians are taking over. I mean, between Trudel Tom and then Finn Sterling and some of these other Australians, of course, Brendan Tarrant, and it's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. I'm not even, he's an Australian guy, right? I'm not throwing him with the rest to compare them, but simply to say that this nation of Australia seems to be producing the best and the worst people in the world right now. But now apparently he's not Australian. Apparently he's English. And yeah, you can go check him out. I think that's all for this abbreviated, extra special podcast that no one will watch, because when you oversaturate your channel with content and you don't space it out day by day by day, you actually reduce the number of views, and really the only people who are going to watch this and the 18th podcast are the people who like to go backwards and watch things from the start or watch content that they've missed, which is, I mean, most people, they look at the subscription feed, they look at the top, whatever's at the top, they're going to watch. They're not necessarily going to scroll down and meticulously go through everything, or click on someone's channel and meticulously go through all the videos, because we don't care about the past. We don't care about history. We don't care about what happened in Jockle Podcast number 17. We care about the most recent Jockle Podcast. So when I kind of layer podcasts on top of each other, or there's an overflow of podcasting, and then that sort of buries the older podcasts under the weight of the new ones, and that's an unfortunate thing. It's not the optimal marketing strategy. But at the end of the day, I don't get a lot of joy. I don't get a lot of joy. I don't get a lot of joy out of the aspect where people watch the video. If I had millions of viewers but no one commented, that is less valuable to me than if I have, 10 viewers and all 10 viewers comment. That to me would be a more valuable experience because I'm putting out videos in order to be an active participant in global dialogue. I'm putting out videos to assert my own vision, my own opinion, and to allow that then to be challenged and critiqued and responded to. So, when someone says, I saw your video, I agree with every single point you made, you completely changed my mind, I now listen to whatever you say, well, I guess I can give myself a pat on the back. But that doesn't leave, there's not much of an antithesis there to be synthesized. There's not really much in terms of a dialogue to be had if someone just agrees with everything I say. I put something out there so that it can be challenged, and then I can, if it's something that I feel confident to challenge, then I can challenge it back. Or if it's something that really makes me question what I've said, then I can reevaluate the content I've put out there. So, yeah, at the end of the day, it's not about, to me, you look at views or something like that, and to me that's like, you're always going to have free riders. You're always going to have people who watch and who don't comment. You're always going to have passive observers who don't contribute to the discussion or feel they have nothing to contribute. They just sit back and say, I agree with everything, or I disagree with everything. And if you disagree with everything, then that's a similar problem, because if we have nothing in common, like for instance, if I speak English and you don't understand English and we have nothing in common, then we can't have a dialogue. Dialogue exists when you have two people who have partially shared interests, but then they also have disagreements. And that's really when dialogue happens. And that's the interesting thing about internal dialogue, is that the people who are best able to have internal dialogues are people who contain the greatest number of internal contradictions. Someone who is animalistic in the sense that they're able to, or that they are completely without self-contradiction. That type of a person really doesn't have a lot of a capacity for internal dialogue. That kind of a person is going to be very boring. And you ask them, hey, what are you thinking about? And they'll be like, nothing. And they'll legitimately be thinking about nothing, because there is no, that's sort of where the NPC meme comes from. Someone who has no internal dialogue, someone who's not talking to themselves all the time. And the NPC meme is interesting in that sense because it subverts, it subverts the meme of like psychosis, or someone who's bipolar, or someone with multi-personality disorder, that if you have some sort of internal dialogue, you must be schizophrenic. Well, the NPC meme turns that idea on its head and says, no, if you don't have an internal dialogue, then you're the one with the problem. You are the soulless individual, and to have a soul really means the ability to examine your life, to criticize yourself, to question yourself, to always be evolving, to be changing, to be destroying that which is untrue, that which is false, and then to be giving birth to that which is more adapted to the present situation. So yeah, contradiction is important. Activity, the meeting of contrast, fire and ice, the stillness of fire, the stillness of ice combine to create the living dynamic that is life and struggle. So that's what I'm participating in. That's what you can participate in too, should you wish, by commenting or making a video response, because we always like to hear people's voices. That we are always looking for intentionality. We're always trying to understand where someone's coming from, and if I can hear your voice, then I can understand where you're coming from, what your intentions are, what your perspective is, implicitly based on things like what's your regional accent, what's your vocabulary of choice. I can perhaps infer, even subconsciously, maybe even consciously, I don't understand what I'm perceiving, but subconsciously I might be connecting with knowledge in the recesses of my brain. Oh yeah, they're referencing this person, or they're using this kind of vocabulary, therefore they're coming from this kind of a context. And it helps me form archetypes of different sorts of people and what sorts of people believe certain things, and allows me to create those connections and correlations that if you just leave a text comment, I can't infer all of that. Now some of that might be false inference, Some of that might be false stereotyping. Some of that might be, you know, outlier data. But even outlier data is interesting, and it's stimulating, and it's provoking. So that's why I like to hear people's voices. And you know, of course, another reason why I like to see people's faces. Yeah, so participate in the discussion. That's why I mentioned the book club, because he's participating in a discussion. He's putting out his face. He's putting out his voice. Even if a lot of his videos are satirical or funny or nonsensical or, you know, self-critical or post-ironic or whatever you want to label him as. You could say he's being unproductive, he's making a fool of himself. I would say he is a charming young man. And thanks for subscribing to the book club. Thanks for participating, and I hope when you guys look at his videos and look at how, you know, cleverly crafted some of these videos are, maybe you also will be inspired to improve yourself, to put yourself out there, to participate in the dialogue, which is an iteration of the struggle of life. So thank you for listening, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.